Okay, so I'm not going to do an introduction because you don't care and I don't have time. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do as opposed to who I am. What I am is a person who codes for the purpose of social change. And one of the things I want to make clear is that what I'm talking about here is social change, and I just happen to, it's clothed in technology. And so don't anybody be confused about that. Now, one of the things that I learned was that there was when I went to DEF CON once, and there was a guy who presented using less. And that's when I realized that real men write their own presentation software. And the other reason is that I have so much information to talk to you about. There's no way that I can say everything I want to and then talk about the slides, and the slides talk about what I'm saying. So the slides are going to be doing one thing, and I'm not going to follow them, and they're not going to follow me. So you can watch the slides and enjoy that. Now, the other thing, and the reason this is unique, is that this system is a tweet. So the reason it's so simple is because I'm tweeting this presentation as things go on, which gives you opportunity to retweet. Now, there's a little alpha system in here because I had to refactor everything because there wasn't internet working yesterday, so I had to pull everything back to my laptop, but this should have been a cloud service. And I'll be releasing source code for this if other people want to use this kind of thing. And then I'm actually going to use, hopefully, a QA function at the end to actually moderate the tweet stream, and you guys can actually ask questions using it. So as you tweet, you can look at what you can retweet my slides or comment on my slides using Twitter. So enjoy. And of course, we all wonder about why people do things like that. And then if you want to follow me, that's the easiest way to make everything work. So one of the things that I want to talk about is the foundational ethics of our community, and I want to talk about that because I have something different to say about it. So let's talk, and this will be an interesting point because if a picture comes up on the screen, I'm going to be really happy. So, oh yes, we're really happy because the presentation software now supports pictures. That was an alpha feature. Okay, so real quickly, how many people know what this means, the little dichotomy that I've put here between these two things? How many feel familiar with it? How many people here are geeks? Just real quick. Okay, if you're a geek and you're interested in open source, you need to understand the difference between two perspectives in our community that are outlined here and here. This guy thinks open source is really cool and makes better software, and really that's all that matters because eventually it takes over anyways. So you don't really need to talk about things like ethics. You just talk about great software, and that's it. Now the other guy, the guy on the right, says this is an ethical issue, and all software should be modifiable, even the stuff that runs your Xbox, and it's all supposed to be stuff that you, as a user, can control yourself. Now, very quickly, how many people can agree with this guy? How many people agree with the other guy? Okay. How many people don't care? Okay, so one of the things that my mom taught me, who was my first philosophy professor, was that a lot of times when a question is difficult, it's because you're asking the wrong one. And I've asked you the wrong question. I've asked you to choose which. And the right question is not which. So I got my notes are a little slow. The other thing is it takes a little time. It's like, tweet, present. Okay, the minute I ask you the question of when is Stallman right, when is control an ethical issue, the minute I say that, you know the answer. I'm going to say in healthcare, well, that's the time when it's really critical. So by asking the right question, I've made the answer easy. So again, and we wait. Whoops. There will be no leaning. Okay, so I want to talk not about open source software. I want to talk about an ethical issue. I want to talk about ethics in software. So how do I do that effectively? Well, if you're talking about ethics in software, you start with Hippocratic Oath, right? And there's a great history there that you can read about the Hippocratic Oath. And I'm going to spend about 2 minutes on this, which of course is justice for this kind of massive ethical issues that are in the Hippocratic Oath, because we have some time constraints, and that's just the way it goes. So let's talk about the things we don't agree on in it. So for instance, not everybody thinks that the change in the Hippocratic Oath with regards to abortion and euthanasia is appropriate. We don't all think that's the way it goes. But since I'm not discussing those kinds of things, I can move right along and talk about some of the things we do agree on. The kinds of things that have changed over the course of medicine that we kind of all see as valuable changes in the way we ethically view medicine, right? So now, what's the most important thing? I think the most important thing is the change between art and science. It used to be in art. They used to think of themselves as artists, and now doctors think of themselves as scientists. Well, that's an important change. What specifically do they say about science? Well, what they specifically say about science is that you have a responsibility to respect the science from before, and you have the responsibility to respect, to pass on everything you know. Now, this is kind of interesting because you should read this carefully, right? This is not actually saying that doctors have a responsibility to do science. They just have to respect the people who have done it already, and if they happen to come across some science, they have to pass that along too. So if they're out walking their dog and they come across some scientific knowledge in medicine, they have an ethical responsibility to pass that on to future doctors. Or if they hit it with their car, they have to throw it in the back of the truck, and they have to pass it along, right? It's kind of a joke, right? Is this notion of kind of, what would that be, like roadkill science? I mean, obviously that's not how they think about it, but it's not explicitly called out. So if we look at that, if we talk about evidence-based medicine and the responsibility, we can see that some of the things in the history of medicine are actually can be reframed as failures to conduct science. So for instance, when we think about bloodletting, right? We think, oh, this is arrogant, it was crazy that they were doing that, but bloodletting is exactly the right thing to do for some patients some of the time. It was a failure to distinguish when the treatment was appropriate and when it wasn't. You see, it's a failure to conduct the experiment. And with bloodletting, using the information systems that were available when they were doing bloodletting, which was a pen and a paper, a doctor could have created enough evidence to prove to himself that it was a bad idea, but they didn't. Right? For a long time, they didn't. It's a failure to conduct science. It's a failure to have, it's an inappropriate relationship with the evidence, right? So I want to reframe a lot of these discussions about, are we doing science? Okay, so what else? Well, good examples are things like washing your hands. Do we need to know why washing your hands helps? Or can we just wash your hands because we have evidence that washing hands reduces sickness? Well, at least a decade went by before we understood why washing your hands was important because of bacteria, after we had evidence for that fact. Now, we also fail to consider evidence from other industries. What is the greatest single improvement in the quality of healthcare in the United States in the last decade? Checklists. Checklists in surgery are the greatest single improvement. But they've been working for pilots for years. We had evidence, but it was just outside of the domain. You see what I'm saying? A lot of the problems that we have in the ethics of computer science. Now, I'm setting you up. I'm going to let you down. So the next thing I'm supposed to say is, well, EHRs. Yeah, they're not using EHRs. That's a failure of science. It's not a failure of science. Actually, the non-use of EHRs is a reasonable scientific position to take for doctors because there's all kinds of evidence that suggests they don't work. And I'm not going to get into that because I have the slides to do that, and if you really care, you can get on Twitter. But the fact is that EHRs are not necessarily a good idea. There's a difference between good technology in healthcare and mere technology in healthcare. Now, let me ask you a question. Who was the person who did the research that made that fundamental, anybody know? Who did the research that showed that essentially a lot of the EHRs that had been deployed were not being used meaningfully? The big hint is he's now in charge, right? Blumenthal published a paper that showed that if you actually defined, well, these are the things that research shows improve healthcare, and we're going to make a list of them, and then we're going to ask a bunch of people if their EHR does that, and then they found out that people for a long time, the statistics were, in ambulatory care, it's only 10% EHR adoption, but hospitals, hospitals have got this licked. They are all using EHRs. It's like 60 or 70%. Oh, they've got great EHRs. Until you ask, what is an EHR? Is it actually helping? And then, it's actually more like 10% again. It's really low percentages. So when people talk about meaningful use, the reason they talk about things in that way is because most use is not meaningful. That's the reason they frame things that way. Okay, but I don't want to get down on medicine. I want everybody to take a second, and if you're on Twitter, actually consider the improvement of science over time. Most of the people in this room would be dead and in fact, if you just have a conversation at dinner, it's fun. Ask people, how would you have died if you had lived 100 years ago? And most people can think of 1 or 2 or 3 examples of things they would not have survived if they had happened 100 years ago. However, as the Twitter back channel fills with things that should make you feel good about the progress in medicine, I want to create a dark cloud over that. And that dark cloud is that we have reached the end of the time when we can make those kinds of improvements without the use of healthcare software. But we don't have healthcare software that's good enough to move us forward. So this EHRs don't work, EHRs do work dichotomy, it's a big deal because we can't continue on with this wonderful progress, this dramatic lowering of birth defects and infant mortality, much longer lives and much better lives towards the end of our lives. That can't continue to improve unless we start sorting this stuff out, and we're not right now. So now, of course, this is a citation that everybody gives, is that we're doing a lot of errors. It's that we already heard the plane a day example. As cars get safer, it's going to actually become, probably, if things don't change, it's going to become actually a leading cause of death way up there in the top 5, I think. So what kind of errors do you have? A lot of it's communication errors. Now, one of my favorite communication errors is I used to play volleyball, and you'll be sitting there, you'll be waiting for a serve, and it'll go between you and the guy beside you, and you'll be like, okay, I'm going to let you have it. But he does the same thing, right? And then they call that a husband and wife error. Why? Because it sounds like you're arguing about who's going to pick up the kids. No, honey, this morning you were supposed to pick up the kids. We agreed. You said you were going to pick it up. And then the other guy's like, well, no, it was you. And then everybody's just like, who's responsible, right? There was a joke when I was a government contractor. I said, this was a government contractor salute. Not responsible. Somebody else. That's who's responsible. But that doesn't include any of the government contractors in the room. Present company excluded. Okay, so let's talk about where it's worked. There's 3 places it's worked. Islands, Kaiser, and the VA. Let's talk about islands. There are some places, some small locations, the Mayo Clinic, where they've got obsessional, well-funded doctors who can just piddle with it, and they can make things work. Sometimes they use homegrown software, sometimes they use proprietary software. Some of them have worked. 90% of the time that doesn't work, but there's 10% who does, and they work. We need to acknowledge the islands, but the problem with islands is they're islands. It's not systematic. We have very few examples of systematic deployments of EHRs that have been successful. In fact, there's only really 2 in the United States. One is Kaiser. And the lesson between Kaiser is that if you want to deploy electronic healthcare software in a good way, you need $1 billion. That is the lesson of Kaiser. That's what you need to take home, right? Midland, who's actually in the room, deployed Vista, got the same kind of benefits. And how much money did you spend? Not $1 billion, maybe?
Overall project, about 6.3 million.
What was that in relationship? And he said 6.3 million. What was that in the relationship between the other people who also got on that list you got on for HIMSS, which was like the early adopters who've done amazing things, basically?
Probably roughly a third or less.
That's right. They did it faster, cost a third or less, using Vista, and they got all the way to like stage, I think it was 6 at the time, stage 6, right? Okay, so I want to make it clear, Vista outside the VA is also working, but I also want to say, the other example is the VA, but it was an accident. There was never a point where the VA was like, you know what we need to do? Start an open source project internally in the 1980s before we had a term open source, and we need to develop some software. There was no director of the VA who stood up and goes, you know what would be great? You know what would be cool? That never happened. That did not happen. So one of the things that I like talking to crowds like this is that I talk about what is Vista. People don't understand what Vista is, and I got into that community and I spent about a year being confused, right? And so I wrote a document for the Vista community called What is Vista Really?, which is there. And that's probably the most significant thing I've done for the Vista. I'm not really a Vista developer, so this is what I've contributed. Here's an outsider's introduction to what it is, and you can go read that, so I'm not going to talk about it more. But I want to talk about MUMPS a little bit. MUMPS is a really great language for healthcare. There's a lot being said about it. Most of it is invalid. One of the things that really frustrates me as criticisms of MUMPS and Vista is that it's old software. And this is confusing to me because it's not like, an old dog, right? That dog won't hunt anymore because it's too old. Well, if software is merely old but still works really well, we have a name for that. It's stable, right? So it's no longer got bugs that new software has. So merely being old, merely being antiquated is irrelevant. Now, in the room is probably one of the most important projects for Vista is the open source implementation of MUMPS, and the guy who does it is in the room. Let me ask you a question, and he'll answer so you can know who he is. Has MUMPS, your version of MUMPS, come out with a feature recently that it didn't have before that's really cool? And what was it?
Absolutely. We've got several, actually. One of them was the use of database triggers, and the other one is the use of encrypted databases using a plugin architecture.
Which is the one I cared about, right? I really wanted to have in-database encryption, and they recently released that. So MUMPS, just like C and Python, Perl, usual suspects, is actually being developed right now. So it's really old, really stable, being developed right now, and that's what we look for in software, right? I mean, Linux is based on Unix. Unix is really old. It's exactly the same kind of time frame. How many people here would say, I don't use Linux because it's old? I mean, I just want to say that category of argument, people who are saying things like that are almost always uninformed. The other thing that people are confused about with Vista and MUMPS generally is that Vista is not one program. It's about 100 programs. So you're talking about an EHR infrastructure. You're talking about many programs, and that's going to be really important. So I'm going to talk about, and hopefully this will work too. Let's see, this is a different kind of image. It's a PNG. I want to make sure it pops up. So I'm going to talk to you about Vista history. But I'm not going to talk to you about what happened in the dates because you don't care and you won't remember. So what I'm going to talk about is how things started out. Now, the names have been changed to protect the guilty. So somebody starts developing. This is actually at the beginning, which is in the late 1970s, early 80s. They're developing. They're in isolation. What happens next? Well, they start talking. Talking is good. Then they start collaborating and talking, and they're actually writing more modules and shared modules. So that's good, right? So now more people are using it, and this new guy, he's got a new module for his EHR system. Oh, that's cool. That's great. So, okay, we're going to do more collaboration. There's going to be more sites, right? And they're going to do more modules. Okay? Everybody's adopting the modules. It goes around. So I need to actually probably wait. Okay, here we go. Oh, look. Now we've got even more modules, and there's a new one in this slide too, right? This is a new module, but there's also more people who are developing more adopters. And oh, look, they've got a new module too. What happens at this point? This is chaos, right? So what do you do when you've got chaos? Well, you know, who's in charge of this? Who's in charge of that? Let's have a meeting. We'll have a meeting and we'll sort it out. All right, so let's go have a meeting. Unfortunately, the meeting didn't go so hot, and of course this is even more complex. Let's talk about how the meeting went. Coming home from the meeting, that was the result. And the reason is that since the inception of Vista, the actual people who were up at the top, the actual bureaucrats at the VA, had been working on acquiring software in a COTS model. They wanted to do a big bang. We're going to buy some software, and we're going to deploy it. It's going to be awesome, right? And that's the way people think about software development. I encourage you to look at the UK, who just spent like $1 trillion doing that. Didn't go so well. So essentially, what they realized at this point was that if they wanted to continue doing what they were doing, they were not going to be able to have meetings. That was not going to work. The standard government way of thinking, where you get a committee together and you have and you make sure you get all the stakeholders. And if somebody comes up later on who is a stakeholder, I mean, you want to include people. They couldn't do any of that. It had to be an underground movement. In fact, they called this movement the Underground Railroad for this reason. But what they did realize is that they probably should have people who were kind of unofficially in charge of stuff, and they'd have back-channel communications talking about it. So this guy's a master of that node, this guy's the master of that node and that node, this guy's in charge of the little purple one, that guy's over there, and they're all going to communicate back-channel, and they're going to do peer-to-peer software development. Now, what does that sound like? It sounds like open source, a term that wouldn't be used until many years later. In fact, people lament the Underground Railroad as a tragic time in Vista's history, and it is. But if it hadn't happened, the open source peer-to-peer development part of Vista probably wouldn't have happened. And actually, it turns out to be a really good thing. The persecution made them act like an open source project 20 years before anybody was thinking about open source. Okay, so we keep going. see. And the underground is effective. More sites, more modules. They're actually progressing. The problem is that they need to get government approval. Eventually, you can't keep doing this. It's not like you can like computerize the VA and hope that the president doesn't notice. So after a while, they actually convinced the central VA that they should be approved. And what had happened after that? After the VA approved it, mass adoption. But you still have the little M's. You can see them there. Still, you have the peer-to-peer stuff going. Still, you have the open source development methods, not licenses, right? But that doesn't really matter because the federal government is funding all the development, and so it owns all the copyright, so they can all share code without worrying about licenses. And for us, you can get the code out using a Freedom of Information Act. So it acts like open source and can be the foundation for actual open source projects outside, which it is. But in reality, it's just they didn't have licensing. They hadn't figured all that stuff out, but they were acting like an open source project. So one of the reasons people will say, well, Vista's not open source. Well, yeah, that's true. It's not under open source license, but it was developed in an open source fashion. And in fact, the size and scope and result mean that you should think of Linux and Apache and Vista as the kind of massive projects that have proven the open source model. In fact, it's such a big deal in terms of how it's changed things that really you should think of it as on the short list of really cool stuff that's amazing that you should always think of when you think of how open source is cool. Well, the problem with this, now that they've approved it, they've got to think about how we're going to manage this, right? How are we going to do this? So they created a system called Class 1, Class 2, Class 3 software. Now, Class 2 is in between Class 1 and Class 3, and I don't know what that means, so we're going to ignore that. And Class 1 and Class 3 are really what's important because the Class 2 is just a middle ground, but what's important is the inside and outside. Class 1 is the software that everybody has to use from the VA. All the VA hospitals have to use it. And Class 3 is the software that a local hospital can develop. And notice here, I intentionally put the line through stuff. So you can actually, there's systems available for you to make modifications to the core modules in the way you want, right? Now again, they were developing these things. This is not Git development, right? This sounds like, a lot like the kind of thing that Linux Projects is doing the last 2 or 3 years, But this was done in the 80s and 90s. You see what I'm saying? You see how this model, they have the same kind of progression that you see in open source generally, but happening much earlier and without the name of open source. Okay, so now that you get this, boy, you really got a system for taking off, and now we're going to get, now we got some formality. We're going to go ahead and get more adoption, but now it's going to look like this. And then what's really important is the next slide. We're tweeting it. Yeah, it's great. I love suspense, right? Okay, so what does that look like to you? Because I drew it this way so that there's an analogy that you would see, right? What happens is the VA hospitals all get together, and the central organization is actually in servitude to the users. And their job is to determine what software is so good, a mature Class 3 project, that it needs to be imported, and I made it huge so you can see that it's been imported into the core, right? It's actually now, and then it gets distributed back out, right? Well, what does this look like? It looks like a bunch of cells getting a new feature somewhere in a genetic fashion, and then the next generation has that feature exclusively, right? This is an evolutionary process. And I drew the diagram of EHR software and modules intentionally so you can see it literally looks like a cellular evolutionary process, right? So what are the results? Well, I've shown you phases of the development process. And again, my case here is that I want to show you that this is true of all open source healthcare projects because Vista is a template for how you do open source in healthcare, and it's slightly different. So what's the history? Now, I want to point out this is not the quality of the software in the VA. This is the rate of improvement of the quality. Now, most of you are geeks, and so you understand the difference between speed and acceleration. What we want is acceleration, because acceleration gives you more and more and more and more speed. We don't want quality software. We want software that improves in quality, right? It's an important distinction. So when you get this line, which is like underground railroad, centralization as a service, here you see that the software in the VA improves at a dramatic rate. It's getting better faster, right? And lately, It's not. Why is that? Well, because they've been doing things to slow it down. Now, I put a big question mark down there, and the reason is that the new Obama administration, the appointees there, they kind of get this stuff. They kind of understand it. But as I'll show, I mean, the pills that I want them to swallow are not easy. So they're kind of sorting out what to do. It's not clear that Vista inside the VA is going to keep that angle. I think it might pick back up. I hope so. But more importantly, when the Vista community realized that it was that the policy's centralization is a mandate, right, which is where you say that now there will be no distributed development, which is what the VA essentially has decided to do in the last administration, they realized that that was not going to work. And so they forked. World Vista was the fork. And if you look at the history, MedSphere's Open Vista and almost everything else that's really cool in the open source right now happened because, as a result of World Vista's fork. And that was the movement, essentially, of the Underground Railroad outside of the VA. Now, so now what you have is Open Vista, Astronaut Vista, World Vista, VX Vista, these kinds of things. You're starting to see that acceleration. Once it's gotten out of the VA, the private sector now is taking off in the same way. That beautiful angle that says, not only is it good, but it's getting better. Right? That's what we want. Okay, so I think my tweets are, I think this is a little bit out of order, but I can roll with it if you guys can. So one of the things that I want to talk about is how do you make this process faster? How do you get that angle to be as steep as possible to make the improvements happen? Well, when you ask that question in terms of open source healthcare software, what you're asking is how do you accelerate or decelerate evolution, right? So one of the coolest things about, so again, what accelerates evolution in humans? Let's talk about sex, right? Sex is a method for making mutations safer so that your kids will have variants. They'll not be the same, identical as you, and to make that safe. Sex is something, a class of things, really, you could think of as sexy, that are things that make evolution go faster. So now, I can't show you on the next slide, this is what sexy is, because that would piss most of you off, right? But I can show you what's not sexy, and because that's a little safer. And so let me ask you a question. How many of you know what birth control in the United States Marine Corps looks like? You do. You know what's on the next slide, don't you? Let's hope this works. This slide might be twice. You guys will live. So when you have to go in the Marine Corps, they have government-issued glasses, and that's what they look like. That is not sexy. You know what they call them? Birth control. That is United States Marine Corps birth control. It's not sexy, is it? Right? So when you this guy is aware, clearly, that he has something that is going to slow down his chances of having children that are better models than he is. Right? He knows. You can see it on his face. Okay, so, it seems like I've lost a lot of slides. Okay, so I may come in a circle here and pick up more stuff, but if I don't, again, you guys will live. So how does evolutionary systems work? Well, there's basically three components of an evolutionary system. First of all, there's mutation. Then there's a method to actually make those mutations continue across generations. If you have a system that's just constantly mutating, there's no order there, right? You have to have a method for one generation to get the good stuff from the last generation. And then you have to have a method for making that decision, which is selection, which means either, A, you have to have something like sex, which says, in general, women. I was just thinking of, there's this beautiful girl down in the Starbucks coffee downstairs, and there's 5,000 dorks here who like to drink coffee. And, I'm thinking about, what the decision that this person is constantly making, and the answer is almost always no, sorry guys, is are you going to make my kids better. So women actually get to be the selection mechanism sometimes. It's not just death. You don't have to die. The women are actually making a criteria judgment, and it's a method for separating the generations, right? And we're thankful that women do that. So why wouldn't you use Vista? Well, if you're looking, what we're looking for is something that's sexy in a way that Vista isn't. Something that accelerates. Well, why not just use Vista for everything? Vista is so awesome. I've made all those points, and someone else is going to talk later about how Vista is really cool. So who is sexy? OpenMRS is sexy. Why is OpenMRS sexy? OpenMRS is exploring something called aspect-oriented program, which lets you abstract away some things that you normally can't do. A bunch out of MIT. And what are the results of that? I encourage you to follow that link, and you'll see that they have and of course they're doing all kinds of other things. But what's important is that they're concerned with accelerating their own development, and they're going through a lot of the growing pains that the Vista community went through in a lot of the same ways. But if you'll follow them, there's hundreds of sites across the world where OpenMRS has been deployed in developing worlds, which is where it's designed to be deployed, as an EHR to really make things better. So who's sexy? Tolvin is a project, and I think there's somebody here talking about Tolvin. Raise your hand. Maybe? Is he here in the room? No? So Tolvin is a project that...
He will be talking.
He will be talking. So yes, the fact that I didn't get a raised hand does not mean that he's not here. So Tolvin is a project that combines an EHR and a PHR and puts everything on a substrate. I mean, does anybody know what I mean when I say EHR and PHR? Raise your hand if you do not know what I'm talking about. Okay, cool.
PHR.
You don't know what PHR is? A PHR is an EHR that patients use. You know, that's the real short answer. Personal health record or patient health record. Some people actually call them PCHRs, patient-controlled health records. You know, there's a debate, and like any important word, nobody agrees what the acronym means. So, okay, DevoX is a sexy PHR. Why? The whole point of DevoX is to make a PHR act like the iPhone App Store, but respecting freedom. Something that probably a little more like the Debian package repository, where there's freedom and also choice. You can use this module, you can use this web server or that web server, right? It's a tenuous thing, but they're working that out for a PHR, and that is a sexy technology. It will accelerate the adoption. Mirth's job in life is to move data around, right? It's a cool project, and I think there's going to be a lot of talks on it, but what they've done is they separated the details of how this connections and translation should happen, they're called channels, from the actual software that does it. How am I doing on time? I'm good. Okay. So I can go into lunch. So if you guys want to have lunch, just leave, and I'll keep going as long as people want to talk about questions. But so Mirth is by separating those things out, they accelerate the development of connecting into various EHRs and pulling data out because they've got a separation. They've got sexy technology. They have something that's actually allowing them to evolve faster. So OpenVista and MedSphere, they're trying to do some really clever integrations to bridge the gap between the Vista world, which has been going, Vista is a lot like Australia, right? It's an evolutionary system that for people who didn't live in Australia seems very different. But there are reasons why Australia's animals are like Australia's animals, right? They're different, and they're systematically different. So when you go see Vista, because it's been evolving in its own path for so long without connecting with other genetic sources, it's like weird. They'll say things like, well, use the RPC. And of course, everyone who ever hears that says, oh, they've got RPC. No, they wrote their own RPC. So they've done their own stuff and they've got their own technology. So Astronaut Vista is a sexy reinterpretation of World Vista and Open Vista. Its whole purpose in life is to use modern software deployment technologies to start merging software. So when you download and install Vista, which you can do in about 5 minutes now, this is software that's had billions invested in it by the United States government to do EHRs, and you can get it running in a couple minutes in the cloud. You know, so so again. All of these are sexy technologies. And so I've done what I said I was going to do, which is to tell you a little bit about the projects. And I did not cover projects like OpenEMR, which are really cool, but they're talking to themselves. Some PHR projects that I think that are out there are really cool. I'll let them talk about themselves. I'm generally ignoring stuff that is here in favor of talking about things that are not here because I want you to have a broader perspective. But most of all, what I want to do now, and this is the last thing. This is my boss, And she came to me a while back, and she said, I'm utterly frustrated with everything about medicine. And she wrote this book, which I read carefully, and I recommend that you do. And basically this book is a book that's essentially like a defensive driving course for patients. As you go into the hospital, given the kinds of errors that hospitals have, given the kinds you need to do X, Y, and Z. And it's not a page turner. It's not like there's no plot to this book. It's a list of all kinds of things that you need to be aware of to be safer in a hospital. And she says, it's got a whole other section of the book where how to be safer as you go into ambulatory care, because they're very different, right? So there's a list here and there's a list here. And here's some insights that I had after reading her book and what's ultimately led to our collaboration. The first thing that I and almost everyone else who reads the book says, who's had a family member die from a serious illness, is, oh my God, I wish I'd read this before. Oh my God, I wish I'd known all of this evidence, because she links to all the evidence. There's nothing in there that's not justified by research, statistics, everything else. Oh my God, I wish I knew before. Right? I wish I had known when my mom was sick. The second thing I realized is that if I get sick, really sick, I'm not going to have the emotional energy to handle this kind of book. I'm not going to be able to do it now. And this is the message that I think I'm going to bring you back to open source software, right? But I want to, this is now talking about social change. The e-patient movement, one of their catchphrases is, patient is a first-person word. When you say patient, you should not be thinking about others. You should be thinking about yourself. You should be thinking of it in terms of me. It's a closer word to me than it is to you. It's a closer word to me than it is to us. And it's closer to us than it is to you or them, right? I want to reframe that whole notion. You will be patients, and when you are, you're not going to be able to develop cool code to make things work. You're just going to be in a bed going, oh my God, I wish I was in a car in a garage, because at least there'd be some systems here because all of you have instinctive ability to recognize a breakdown in systems. You know when information is not moving. It feels bad, right? You go to somebody who's using paper forms, and you're just like, what are you doing? Right? There's a better way, and it's not a little better. It's a lot better. It's eons ahead, and I can do that for you for $5,000, right? That's the basic notion of technologists. That's how we think about things. When you are a patient, you will not have the privilege of coding a solution for yourself. You will not be able to do it, right? Moreover, the people who are patients now cannot code their own solutions. One of the movements that I want to point out in medicine, I think open source should fully embrace, is that a lot of these projects are talking about a transition between how we think of the problem of health information. A lot of times when people ask me what I do, which, by the way, when people ask that, sometimes they don't actually want to know. So I give them a test. I say, I do software for doctors. And if they go, oh, really? And then I tell them what I really do. And if they go, oh, then I move on and I talk to other people, right? It's pretty simple. But I don't really do software for doctors anymore. That's not the right answer. I think the philosophy of doing software for doctors is fundamentally screwed up. Because having health information work, what that does is it allows you to coordinate care. Well, who benefits from that? And why hasn't electronic healthcare records been adopted? I mean, one of the things that I want to point out, and this is the thing that I want to say very clearly, is that we are in a failure state with health information. People are like, oh, there's money here. Obama has funded this. It's going to be awesome. Money coming in to computerize the industry. What industry has had to be paid to computerize? Name another industry that has had to be paid because they're not convinced that computers are good. That's a crazy notion. When we celebrate the stimulus, which we do, it's a good thing, we should be very aware of the fact that the fundamental need for people to be paid to use computers, that's kind of messed up. Right? We should all feel uncomfortable that this was necessary. Right? So doctors don't necessarily think they need technology. And here's one of the reasons why. Let me give you some examples of why kind of healthcare, because one of the things that people just don't understand is how screwed up healthcare informatics is because of the fact that healthcare is screwed up. So to give you that example, I'm going to give you a little story. And in my story, God and Jesus are chatting. And God says to Jesus, look, I know that it was kind of a pain to go down last time, but I want you to go back and do some healing work. I want to see how this works out. And Jesus said, well, kind of sucked last time, kind of hung out to dry. If we could avoid that, I'd really appreciate it. And he says, well, I don't think that's necessary. We're not going to do the whole salvation thing. In fact, you're going undercover. We're not going to try that again. I want you to go back as a primary physician. I've arranged with a Catholic charity to give you an honorary degree. Apparently, they agree that omniscience is sufficient to skip the 4 years of medical school. And they're going to give you an MD. However, when you go back, the constraints are that you're Catholic. And Jesus says, fine, I can do that. I like the Catholics. It's no problem. So he goes back and he sets up a primary care practice. And so he's doing his thing, and he comes in, and he's just healing people. Come in, lay hands, they heal, they go away, completely healed. No matter what the problem is, done. Period. Done. Does about 2 weeks, and he says, you know what? I haven't got any money. I'm going to hire an office manager. So he hires an office manager. Who's got a lot of experience in billing, and she says, okay, well, tell me what you're doing. He says, well, I've got a lot of energy, so I can see about 12 patients a day. And the reason I can see 12 is I'm working 12 hours a day, and it takes me about an hour to see each patient. First 5 minutes, I heal them. But I've got to spend some time with them. I'm Catholic. They have to have the Holy Sacrament of Confession. Go forth and sin no more. There's a lot of conversations that I need to have with these people. So it's really non-negotiable. I have to spend 1 hour with every patient, which says, well, so what you're saying is that you spend 5 minutes actually treating the patient, but you only you actually spend an hour with them. Well, unfortunately, because of the rules, you can only charge for the 5 minutes. So that's a 5 minute consult, which is the lowest level of procedure. 5 minute consult. I said, okay, well that's okay. Well, not really, because you don't get paid a lot for a 5 minute consult. And he's like, well, I'm healing them of anything. So you're saying I'm not going to get paid well because it only takes 5 minutes? Yeah. And she says, well, what you really need to do is, if you could treat them, if you could spread it out, over a course, and you could spend more time doing it. In fact, if you do it all day, like if it took all day, and you could just hang out in a surgery room all day and then heal them in the last 5 minutes, that would probably work. And he said, well, I can't do that. I'm Jesus. That sounds unethical. So I'm going to keep with my 5 minutes. I'm not going to spend extra time. Well, so what about doing a treatment cycle where they come in for like 50 appointments and then you heal them in the last one? He says, also not good. I'm Jesus. So she says, well, I think it's going to be a problem. You need to hire 3 billers. And he's like, 3 billers? Well, it's kind of complicated to work with the insurance companies. You send them the bill, and sometimes they don't pay. And little Johnny, you saw last week, and you healed of brain cancer, he's got, his parents have both been divorced twice. Well, says, well, you know how I feel about that. I'm not in favor of divorce. He says, yeah, I know, but it happens, and that's the way it is. And, as a Catholic, you have to, deal with all these people. But little Johnny's insurance had 6 insurance companies, one for each of his parents. He's covered 6 times. Each insurance company expects to be paid and expects to pay based on what other insurance companies contributed. You make about $15 every time you see a patient, but you have to talk to 6 insurance companies who are all going to split that $15 between 2 minutes. And you pay your billers about $10 an hour because, that's a good wage. And, underpaying your employees is something you're not comfortable with because you're Jesus. So in average, in order to get about $2.50, you're going to spend about $10 as they negotiate with the insurance company to get the money they want. He says, well, can't I prove that I'm doing really amazing things? When you heal someone of cancer, I'm saving the system a lot of money. He says, well, do you have evidence of the diagnosis? No, I don't send them for tests. I need to heal as many people as possible. It takes an hour each. I need to see people and to get them out. I can't send them out for a test and then bring them back. That's no good. So, well, that means you don't have evidence that you're doing anything more than just talking to them for 5 minutes. Unfortunately, because ICD codes, that means that you're just going to have that ICD code, which is a code, an ontology for tracking diagnosis. You can't code it as anything more than just a primary care visit because you don't have any evidence to back that up. And when you're audited by the insurance companies, they're going to find you wanting. right? And you can't say you did anything else except a 5-minute procedure, and there's an ontology for that that's run by the AMA. It's interesting, little known fact, the AMA, American Medical Association, whose job it is to represent doctors in the United States, makes more money from licensing CPT codes, which are these procedure codes, than they do from the membership fees. Now, when they go and represent doctors for health informatics, do you think they're saying, hey, keep using the CPT codes among anything else so we can keep getting paid, or do the very best thing for doctors? Answer is door A. So procedure codes are horribly inaccurate. They're very difficult for anyone like me to get data out of, but because of the money involved, we can't get away from them. And Jesus, being explained all this, is not happy. He's not pleased at all. So because of diagnosis codes and CPT codes and problems of billing, even though the fact that I am providing perfect medicine, I'm going to go out of business in 2 months. So he gives a call to a God, and he says, it's happening again. I'm a sacrificial lamb. I'm not doing this. So if anybody ever asks you, what would Jesus do? Now you know that the answer is not primary care. So as I approach this, what I realize is that system is so messed up that trying to reform it may be impossible and may not work. And as a technologist, I'm interested in problems that I can solve. I'm not going to go march and hold a sign and be like, I'm against your cause here. Because, as a technologist, I can change things. I can code things. In the world of the cloud, I am a demigod. I can make it do anything I want. I have this tremendous power, and I'm not going to go hold a sign for an hour, because if I code for an hour, I can really make a difference. So I'm looking for problems, social problems, that I can solve with technology. And what I want to convince you of is that you too can do that. And I want to ask you a question as a technologist, and I'm asking really not just the people in the room, but the people who are watching and the people who care about open source technology. What are you going to tell your grandkids that you did with your life? Well, I enabled high-powered distributed websites with NoSQL. That is not what a 3-year-old wants to hear. They don't care. They don't even know what that means. I don't even know what that means. So, that's just not going to work. What you want to say is, I use technology, and if it happened to be NoSQL using, powering, all this kind of stuff, to eliminate tuberculosis. I was part of the effort that took 40 years but cured AIDS. I did my part in a movement that changed the world. I did a part of taking age even farther, of making people's lives even better. There's about 1,000 people who probably would have needed dialysis every day or every week for their entire lives that don't, because I figured something out cool once. That will impress a 3-year-old. You can tell them what tuberculosis means. They can understand that. And when you are 80 years old, or 100 years old, because you've made these improvements, right? When you're 100 years old and you're looking back, NoSQL is not going to be that interesting. And I'm not using that to dog SQL. I don't think SQL is going to be that interesting either. It's not that kind of a thing. If your thing is SQL, welcome to open source healthcare informatics. If your thing is NoSQL, welcome. If you care about artificial intelligence or jQuery, or I don't care. In fact, if you care about anything said in any room in this conference at any time, welcome. We want you. I personally, for no charge, and that could be a lot because there's a lot of you out there, for no charge, if you come to me, I promise you I will find you a project who needs what you do. I promise that I will find you an area, find you somebody who's excited to have you, who's desperate for somebody who understands your technology here, right? Who really needs you. And you will make a difference with your life. Not only that, I would like to offer you, some of you, not all of you, the opportunity to do what I've done, which is to go pro. This is all I do. I don't do anything else besides try to use technology to do social change. Try to change the relationship with doctors and patients. Try to empower patients. So when I talk about my work with this organization, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take the locus of control and move it back to patients using information technology. That has happened in so many other areas. Amazon makes users have a better relationship with books, right? It really changed things. Remember, it's hard to remember because we're so used to Amazon. Right? They changed your relationship with books for the better. That same thing can happen for patients. And when you talk about the Connect project, I'm not talking about them because they're amazing and they've got their own talk. If you talk about Connect and then you talk about the PHRs like in DevoX, what we're talking about is a fundamental restructuring. It's not just having technology, it's having good technology, right? It's not just, it's not just having the technology work for the doctors, it's having the technology work for the patients, right? Because right now, nobody coordinates care. And so you can make the doctors coordinate the care, or you can give the patients the opportunity to coordinate the care. But it's not being done right now. So it's not like, oh, if you empower patients with a PHR, they're going to have an antagonistic relationship with doctors. They're going to be doing stuff that nobody's doing, right? So I think that's really important. Now, one of the things I want to go back into, and I know I'm kind of rambling, but my alpha slide system is not working too much, is how do you slow evolution down? So one of the things that really matters for evolution is population size, right? The reason why invasive species coming from Africa and Asia are worse in places like Australia or do you guys need to go? Because if lunch is starting, please don't be rude, just go. How do you slow down evolution? You make the population size smaller. That's why when the VA said we're going to consolidate instances of Vista to a few large data centers, the whole Vista community, the people who would actually build the software, hollered, screamed, and no. Why? Because if you have 4 sites that are doing Vista versus 400, what you've done is you've made Africa into Australia as far as an evolutionary process. An evolutionary process accelerates when you have more generations, or in each generation you have a bigger population, right? So that's why people are against that centralization. If you restrict mutation, you slow it down, and that's why people are upset about the fact that the hospitals are no longer allowed to do their own development. But the worst thing, and this is something else I want to roll back to, the worst thing, and I want to talk about ethics again, the worst thing you can do to slow down evolution is take a part of the system and say that part is no longer subject to evolution. How do you do that? You put a proprietary module in an otherwise open source project. Now, let's talk about Stallman. Why do we need freedom? Why do we have the GPL? Why isn't Apache good enough? The GPL keeps it free. It keeps the freedom. People who are against freedom say it's viral freedom. It's, this freedom, it affects all the other software around it. Well, let's imagine, if you're talking about a human system and human evolution, that we would have the same livers that gorillas do. That's just ludicrous. That's crazy to think that we would need the same systems. And when you make changes in a system like Vista, which I actually have an example of changes in Vista, it's pretty powerful. In Vista, what you have is a slow progression of cross-system integration that really dramatically improves healthcare. There's an example of a drug, and I can't remember which one. It's very dangerous to use, but schizophrenics sometimes respond to it, if other antipsychotics have failed. But it's dangerous to use. There are side effects that can be dangerous. You have to watch it. You have to monitor it with labs. So let's talk about, and what they have developed recently in Vista is a system that sits partly in the psychiatric code, which says, okay, well, this person is a diagnosis of schizophrenia, so they qualify for this. All the other drugs haven't worked, so they're qualified to try this drug now. And now we're going to give the drug, which is a pharmacy function. But the pharmacy is going to automatically start a series of lab results, lab tests, so that the tests are going to be ongoing, so we can watch very, very carefully. And then the pharmacist is going to get notified anytime this person's picking it up that they need to look at the labs to see if the labs have changed so that they can safely give this medicine. Now, that's one drug talking about one area of medicine, and it's right in Vista. Why is it right? Because they were able to change the pharmacy system, the psychiatric system, and they were able to change all of these different systems. The core that tracked the patient data, they were able to change everything. So if you can't change one thing, then what happens is that the whole flow breaks. Well, I can change, it would be really cool if we could do this thing for this one drug, which really would help, but we can't because we can't change the lab system because the VA decided they're going to hand the lab software contract to Cerner. Proprietary software that can't be modified. Now, when you call Cerner up, what they're going to say is, it's going to cost, and then they say something. And it doesn't matter if they say $5. That project is dead. It was a project by somebody who can't go through the government process to get even $5. It's just not worth it, right? So proprietary software changes. Open source software evolves. But let's talk about the difference between healthcare IT. Fundamentally, is that what we're trying to do is model healthcare. None of you know what that is, right? If you're on the Apache project, you can know the HTTP protocol. You can know it like the back of your hand. Your best friend, your wife, your spouse, you can know the protocol. It is a knowable thing, right? It's a substrate that's solid. Or if you're on the Linux project, you can know the x86 chipset, you know? And there are people who do. There are people who love these things, right? They've got T-shirts that say, I love x86. I mean, you know, just look around at all the crazy things people love. And what you're seeing is solid substrates to build software on. But if you don't know what you need, then you have to have an evolutionary system to get you there, because you have to do constant changes, constant experiments. And if you increase the cost of changes, you slow that process down, right? So it's not that it's a good idea for there to be open source. That's not the argument that I'm making. That's not what I'm telling you. I'm telling you this is the only thing that will work. And the evidence I have that this is the only thing that will work is that it's the only thing that has worked. The study about the EHRs, right, that showed that most of them weren't doing it, was like a footnote, a brief, aside at the results of the study. They're like, well, we found out that about, 3% of all hospitals have the highest level. And it's a very interesting study. I think you should go take a careful look at that, because what it showed was there's about 50 things we should be doing, but nobody has that. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a list of things you really need to do that actually gets the number as high as possible, so that they can say as many people as adopted it, and they still only got to like 10%. But for the big list, like 50 things that you really should be doing that there's evidence for, only like 1 or 2 or 3% of the hospitals in the country were doing it. And then like, you know what? It's actually a shame we didn't extend the study to Vista, because we know about Vista, and Vista does all 50 things and is available in every single VA hospital in the country, which means that 50%, more or less, of all the hospitals in the country that are actually doing everything you're supposed to be doing are VA hospitals. So when you think of proprietary software versus open source, you're used to thinking in terms of Microsoft owns the desktop. If you are using a computer, people are using computers out there, there's an 80% chance you're using Microsoft Windows. Proprietary software has the lion's share, and open source struggles to catch up and be better and kind of expand into the market. The opposite is true in healthcare. The Microsoft of healthcare is an open source project. And the reason that is, and there's so many business plans that people will actually call me like, what we're going to do, we've got an idea. What we're going to do is going to be the Microsoft of medicine. Let me give you a little hint for people who are starting projects like that, trying to get funding with that pitch. If Microsoft can't be the Microsoft of medicine, you may not have a shot. Right? If Microsoft can't do it, you may be in trouble a little bit. That business plan is not so hot. It's not going to work. And there's a reason Microsoft is not the Microsoft of medicine, and Epic's not the Microsoft of medicine, is because it's not possible to be Microsoft of medicine. And to compliment, I'm not really dogging Microsoft. Being Microsoft is harder than it looks. Most proprietary software companies can't be Microsoft, right? But Microsoft can't be the Microsoft of medicine because what they do, their process, can't adopt to what medicine is. And that's the reason why everybody in the country isn't using an EHR that's written by Microsoft. So, again, my evidence for the reason that, so I want to explain just kind of summarize. I believe this is an ethical issue. I believe that the only ethical licenses that you should be using in healthcare, although I tolerate any open source license, I really wish everything was GPL or AGPL, because that's the license that guarantees you that later on you're not going to get an invasive parasite that's going to slow down your evolutionary process. So, this is the reason why a lot of us are against any proprietary software and against licenses that have the possibility that proprietary software can come in. That's the reason why people like me are so crazy about that. And people will be like, oh, that guy's one of those religious dudes. Well, I prefer the term being right. And that's the way I like to think about it. And I hope I've made my case today. I hope you see, at least, if you accept any or all of my arguments, you see kind of why a lot of us are thinking in this way, and why some of us are so religious about the subject. And I also want you to see that it is an ethical issue. No matter how you think about it, it's an ethical issue because the consequences are so huge. So with that, I'm done, and I went out of order because I've got alpha development presentation software, but that's okay. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm going to let you go because I think that's what I'm supposed to do. But if you guys want to, if anybody wants to stay and ask me questions, I will answer them. So you had a question over there? Thanks. Back, you were first.
Yes, I'm curious of the use of the GPL original Vista. Isn't that inherently going to prevent a upstream patching because the original Vista code is public domain? Once you go GPL, you can't go back.
Yeah, that's a problem. The original Vista code is not GPL, and the VA, practically speaking, might resent GPL software. That's a serious problem. But you have to understand, from my perspective, Vista is awesome, and I think there's going to be somebody who makes a case later on much better than I am. The guy who actually makes that case kind of for a living is going to make that case that Vista is awesome. But look where it's not awesome. It's not awesome for those of us outside the VA and every place where proprietary software is used in the VA because they can't re-release it. So...
But you got to get rid of, so outside of this proprietary software, won't Vista lose steam because of that impedance mismatch?
No, I understand what you mean. And the question is, what is Steam? Is Steam working with a proprietary module, or is Steam working with only open source code? It depends on how you define Steam. And there's a lot of people, I think, like DSS, who think that Steam means working with as many people as possible. And they disagree with me on this issue. And when you make an ethical statement, when you say, I'm going to enter the ethical debate, the reason that's interesting is that not everybody agrees with you. And I don't want to pretend like everybody does, because that's definitely not the thing. And the other thing I want to point out is that I want to cooperate with people who think differently about me, with me in this, which is the, free software cooperate with open source people all the time. So I want to develop with them while not compromising my values. One of the problems with licensing in Vista is that OHT, Open Health Tools, has decided to use EPL as their default license. And that's a problem because the LGPL is the best way for people who think that freedom is really important, right? Because I am not going to tolerate any non-free software in my healthcare code. I will not do it. It's a matter of principle for me. LGPL, software that's released on the LGPL, is my way of saying I'm going to still work with the guys who feel differently than me. And if you want to release software, proprietary license or EPL or anything else, an LGPL works like that. That's the bridge license.
Then isn't that going to conflict with many public academic institutions that can't use licenses like that? They have to stick to BSc and MIT because they can't get the patent.
Well, and you're right. And so the question becomes...
I mean, it seems like you're going to get to a point where you're going to be in an inherent conflict with federal regulations and state regulations that are...
No. Big problems. No, this is a reasonable debate on the other side of the coin.
I understand the ethical energy that you're putting into the argument, but at some point you got people who have to make pragmatic decisions,
and that's the reason why this is the reason why the GPL. This is the reason why I think the GPL is so important. It's because the GPL forbids people from making pragmatic decisions that interfere with long-term freedom, and I don't care. I do not give a damn if over the next 5 years some great proprietary software can't automate dental in Vista. If 100 years from now the dental system in Vista rocks because it was allowed to evolve. And any time you introduce that kind of anchor of proprietary lock-in in any part of an open source code base...
You're excluding more than just proprietary. I mean, you're focusing on...
Yes, you're absolutely right. I'm excluding academic institutions. I'm including anybody who, for whatever reason, has taken a position on thought law, which is jokingly, ironically referred to as intellectual property, that is compatible with the people who do have an interest. So academics, even the federal government, sometimes cannot accept my position. I get that, and I still don't care, because it still doesn't matter. If you add up everything that they will do, it's wonderful functionality, right? It's great stuff that locks you in and doesn't allow you to evolve. Well, and this is the thing, is that the distinction that I'm making between Stallman and Eric Raymond is that Eric Raymond looks at the Xbox 360 and goes, I don't care, and it'd be cool if I could play a video game. That'd be awesome. And I do too. I have an Xbox 360. I love it, right? Now, and the reason I do that is because I don't think it matters there, right? So there are areas where it doesn't matter. I'm not defending the free software notion anywhere. What I'm saying is here, we really need to have it. And the reason we need to have it is that we don't really know where to go, and it will slow us down. It will slow us down initially to not do this, but long term it speeds you up. And so what you do is you say, for the sake of design, we're gonna take 2 steps forward where we normally would have been able to only take 1, but we're going to go into a design model versus an evolutionary model. The question is not what software is good. The question, it just doesn't matter what software is good. Because it's not like Microsoft versus Linux, where Microsoft is good and Mac OS is good. That's good. It's good that it's good. Right? It doesn't matter. Because we don't know what medicine should be. We don't know what healthcare IT is. We're inventing it as we go along. And so 20 years from now, nobody knows what we're going to need to do. And we've got these huge data sources coming in that we don't know what to do with. We've got genomics data, and we've got Twitter live. Search I feel on Twitter, and you will find that about a third of it is healthcare information. Right? Gigabytes of data. Genomics, gigabytes of data. And we are not ready to handle these things. And we don't know what we're going to need. So as we make anchors, it's like, oh, well, because the university or the federal government, because they want something, we're gonna go with a license that allows proprietary to come in. Well, what happens is that because that's allowed, 20, 30 years from now, we don't have what we need. And we don't know what we're going to need. So it's not like an operating system where it's like, the roadmap is this, and we know where we're going. We don't know where we're going. So the design philosophy is a cancer literally a cancer, because it's a cell system that's not cooperating with the rest of your cell systems, right? It's a cancer on the fundamental process, and people don't realize it, and they're tempted by it. And this is the same thing that Stallman says. I'm not saying anything that Stallman's not saying. The difference is that when you look at something like the Xbox or even the Macintosh laptops that everybody has in the room, it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because if he loses that laptop, he's going to be very unhappy for a month.
So you think because other parts of medicine have a similar problem, the patenting of PCM simulated practice done by people who have patent.
So, and I apologize, I'm not repeating the question. I should be. So you're saying, do you have a problem with the other areas of medicine where intellectual property is holding things up? You have to remember that patenting in healthcare and healthcare informatics as well is a very, very complex issue. What you're doing with a patent is you're giving somebody in society, a monopoly, which is lock-in, that's temporary. Over the long term, it's temporary. There is a limit to how long they last. Now, Stallman says for software, you're going so fast that 20 years is an eternity. But there is a limit. So, and what it lets you do is it lets you finance the development of very, very expensive stuff. Well, healthcare software is not actually expensive stuff. So if you give patents on healthcare software, that's a terrible idea. And that holds society back tremendously, because there is no justification for the kinds of financing you need to get, that you get with a patent. And in fact, I'll be releasing an example of how a patent troll attacked me in the next couple of days. You should look for a blog post about that. But the interesting thing about healthcare IT, which is different than almost all the other patent in software debates versus patents in drugs debates, because we all agree patents in drugs are good. We need them as a societal mechanism to fund expensive drugs, is that there's a lot of cases like you're describing that are kind of in between. And I'll be honest, I don't know how to sort that out. If you're using a software to analyze and create something that's a genomic patent that would be something that normally would be patentable as a drug, I don't know. And that's a very complicated issue. But with patents, the basic notion is that if you are giving lock-in to somebody, even a patent is better than proprietary software, because proprietary software is a monopoly that never ends, that never gets over. It will never fix itself. And in fact, a valid model, I think, for people who are interested in using proprietary software in healthcare is to say, after 3 years, we will release this as open source. And I think there's a name for that model. But that's a valid way to go, because what you're saying is that we need to make money now, and so we're going to use a proprietary model to fund the current development of software, so everybody has to pay, but you still have the freedom long term to modify it and fork us if you have to. That's a valid model. And financing healthcare software is a problem that I'm very sympathetic to, because people don't want to pay for this stuff, and doctors are damn cheap, right? So they don't want to pay. Nobody wants to pay for this stuff. And if you tell a doctor it's open source and it doesn't cost anything, you know what he heard? It doesn't cost anything. That's what he heard. And if you actually have a conversation where, okay, well, I say free software, and then that means like it's free in beer and then free, and his eyes are glazed over, and you have wasted the opportunity to talk to a doctor. Because those kind of distinctions, I mean, they just don't care, and they resent the fact that you're trying to explain to them those kinds of high-level concepts. She's like, you were wasting my time, and the one thing that doctors care about is their own time because of this procedure problem. So, any other questions? I don't want to exclude anybody else who wants to talk about something else besides the big debate. Does everyone want to keep talking about the big debate? Does anybody want to go away and have some lunch? Yeah.
I really like how you frame it as a justice issue, because I don't think a lot of people see it that way. They see it as a monetary issue and all these other parameters, but don't forget that these people's lives we're talking about. Not just lives here in the United States as the richest country in the nation, but for the long term, this is the lives of everyone on the planet. Not just people who can afford it.
So the commenter said, I appreciate the fact you framed it as a justice issue because it's a long-term issue and it's a very, very important issue. And that's exactly my point. One of the things that's problematic in healthcare is that, especially in the VA, where you have a lot of political sensitivity, we're not very comfortable with flaming death. And what I mean by that is if you look back on the history of airplanes, remember if you've seen Indiana Jones and you've seen that like archaic plane flying, right? Every once in a while, those resulted in flaming death. And the people who grew up at that time, and if you look at actually any age before ours, people understood that death in the wilderness or death, by Indians or death by something, it was a price that everybody was willing to pay to get what they wanted. And they understood that those few people dying, horrible deaths that nobody wants and nobody would want to wish on anybody, is better than, say, everybody dying. And because we tolerated that in the airline industry, now we have these really safe planes. So when you evolve a healthcare system, one of the things that's distasteful for people who hear that is like, you want me to do an experiment 10 times? So think about what I mean, when you talk about the VA and my advice to them, it's like, well, I'm giving them a pretty bitter pill. The pill is, what you should do with Cerner is you should pay them the full value of the contract just to make them leave. Just pay it. You have a contract with them. You're obligated by law to pay Cerner. Pay them and then walk away from that. And then fund 10 projects with about the same much of money, but all split between these 10 projects to do labs again, and fund all of them. And maybe 6 of them will kill somebody because they do labs wrong. So what that sounds like is, okay, have you ever heard of the term government waste? You want us to throw away what we've bought. You want us to spend the money again, not once but 10 times to buy exactly the same thing, and then you're telling us that it's okay that it's going to kill somebody? And the answer is, well, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying, because there's just no other way that it works. And in healthcare, it's the thing is that you ask a doctor about that, they're comfortable with it because they're, like, well, we got slammed in the ER last night and 5 people came in, and I was the only doc, and I had to pick which one I was going to save. I did that last Saturday too. They understand that. It's triage. Basic. You have to help the people who are helpable. But for some reason, on a political level, there's obviously distaste for what I'm saying. You can imagine hearing what I'm saying, but there's no other way to do it. There's no other way to do it. Anybody else? And I'm going to go away from the microphone in a second, so if you just want to talk to me, that's going to be a possibility. I'm going to go to lunch. Okay, I'm done. Bye.